This is great because this is the Junck Colloquium in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, but we are partnering with the Political Science Department for the first time on a joint speaker, which has been a lot of fun. And I'm going to let Frank introduce Ed because Frank was on Ed's dissertation committee, and they published a lot together. But Frank is a professor over in political science, as you all know, and with that,
okay, thanks. Actually, we published one article together, but it was the best article.
It's really good. It's really good.
And I was not on Ed's committee, but I wish I would have been, because I didn't get to know him until he was, I guess, far enough along. But anyway, because of John McCarthy being at Penn State, and I was there for 10 years, I got to know some of John's students. Ed is a really good example of how wonderful it is to work with really great students who go on to very successful careers. So I want to just show you this book that he's published and now gotten tenure at UCLA in the Sociology department. So it's just a great pleasure to have you here, and I look forward to what you say.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Frank, for the great introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here today and to visit UNC again. What I'll be talking about today is my book, Grassroots for Hire, which is about the field of consultants who mobilize mass participation on behalf of companies, on behalf of advocacy groups, on behalf of trade associations, really a wide variety of different organizations they work with. And I think it'll help to start out with a story to help introduce this a bit. Some of you might have been following some of the controversy surrounding for-profit colleges. The industry of for-profit colleges, often like to call it the private sector educational industry, they tend to have a lot of controversy surrounding them. Right? They're one of these industries that seems to have controversy trailing them wherever they go. You're probably familiar with some of these, especially the University of Phoenix, known for its online degree granting. Some of them are more professional and technical schools, do vocational training for people taking night classes and things like this. It's really been incredible to look at the expansion of the for-profit college sector over the last 20 years or so, where this is really a minor field, really until about the last 15 years. Up until around 2000, their enrollments didn't get above 500,000 students nationwide, but then you see this incredible increase over the course of the 2000s, with enrollments getting above 2 million by the year 2010. And some of the controversy swirling around this had to do with the fact that a lot of the students who go to these for-profit colleges end up graduating with really high levels of debt and a lot of difficulty paying off the loans that they rack up while they're in school. And so here's a New York Times headline, "In hard times, lured into trade school and debt." This is under the overall headline of The New Poor. Senator Harkin, a critic of the for-profit college industry, points out that their dropout rates top 50%. USA Today headline in 2009, college graduates struggled to repay their loans. And so there was sort of controversy after controversy about debt, about aggressive recruitment, especially aggressive recruitment of people in relatively disadvantaged situations. A lot of times we're talking about working parents, we're talking about veterans. And so the Department of Education comes along with a proposal to crack down on the for-profit colleges and to find some way to ameliorate some of these problems. There's this provision under the Higher Education Act in 1965, under Title IV, that requires that the for-profit schools and vocational programs show that they prepare students for gainful employment. That becomes the sort of key word here, gainful employment in a recognized occupation. This has always been on the books, but they really hadn't had much reason to enforce it all that tightly. And so the rule held that if these schools didn't prepare these students for gainful employment, they could essentially take away the school's access to federal student loans. And of course, this is part of the controversy too, because a lot of these student loans are coming from the federal government and going right through to the shareholders, right, of these for-profit colleges, which has raised a number of concerns about the federal government subsidizing an industry. And so the Obama administration tries to crack down with these gainful employment rules, trying to enforce this to a much higher standard than they had before, such that if these schools are graduating students who have really high levels of debt and the average wages in the industry that they're going into are likely to not allow them to be able to repay that debt, that they shouldn't get those student loans. And, the market started to notice too, right? Here's the stock price of the University of Phoenix over this time period, with some pretty substantial declines after the gainful employment rules started to be introduced in 2009. And as time goes on, they're getting more and more negative attention as well. And so, think about what those for-profit colleges need to do in this political situation. Right? Any company, when they're facing some kind of controversial situation, some threatening regulation, maybe they're facing protests, they've got a difficult situation on their hands, and they usually need to start to leverage their sources of social capital, if you will. And so here's a set of examples of some of the different sources that they could turn to, right? They could turn to their shareholders, probably are politically connected and influential people, yet are very obviously connected to the company and have a strategic interest in the way the political decision goes. Right? They could go to their trade associations. Certainly heavily regulated industries do this all the time. Pharmaceuticals do this. Wal-Mart often goes to its distributors, right? The distributors rely heavily on Wal-Mart because they're such a big player in the field. And of course, there's the most traditional route, right? The right-hand side. Go directly to public officials through conventional lobbying. And that's certainly something that the for-profit colleges did. Here's some data from the Sunlight Foundation on for-profit college industry lobbying over this time period. And you do see this major spike in how much conventional lobbying they're doing around the time of the 2010 introduction of these gainful employment rules. But that was not far enough for them, right? They felt that they really needed to go to extra lengths because for many of these organizations, it actually was a fight for their life because they had such incredible problems with student debt that they actually could have lost access. Under the most forceful version of these rules, they could have lost access to student loans altogether. And so what did they do? They went to their customers, right? And so a curious thing starts to happen, where not too long after the gainful employment rules are introduced, you start to see a wave of activism of students on college campuses, these for-profit college campuses. You see groups like Students for Academic Choice, right? Had this somewhat charismatic leader, Dawn Connor, who was a veterinary student who took this on as her personal goal to try to fight for the for-profit colleges, saying that this is actually about my access to education. And here I am, a vulnerable working mother, right? And this is going to cut off my access to loans. This is unfair. This is targeting me and students like me unfairly. You start to see some similar frames in a couple other organizations too that seem to pop up. Coalition for Educational Success, the Save Student Choice, Student Access Student Choice Coalition. You're probably thinking that you're hearing some similarities across these names. My Education, My Choice. These organizations started to sprout up at all these different campuses and were heavily coordinated. And so it was sort of interesting to think about what role this was playing for the industry. You see, here's some of the ways that they frame their claims. This is one of the student activists from Students for Academic Choice saying, Senator Harkin says that the for-profit colleges view their students as no more than cogs in their profit-making machine. But as students and alumni of proprietary colleges and universities, we choose our schools with eyes wide open, and we are proud of our accomplishments. To denigrate our schools is to devalue the education that we have worked hard to attain. So kind of playing on the stakeholder politics of, I've been going to this school, I'm invested in it, I'm motivated to support it. And so what's interesting to look at then was, well, where did these student groups come from? Right? I mean, it might have seemed to many observers that this was an organic student movement on these campuses. The reality was that a whole field of consultants had helped out the industry to create these organizations, to give them talking points, to help get them to the lobbying days in Washington. And some of these groups are really quite active political consulting firms. Lanny Davis, the former Clinton administration lawyer, Law Media Group, Global Strategy Group, and probably the most controversial consulting firm here, DCI Group, which has worked with a number of embattled industries over time. And so grassroots advocacy, this participation of the mass public, is not just something that conventional advocacy groups do. And I think as social scientists, we haven't appreciated that as much as we should. There are lots of these campaigns. The for-profit colleges are not the only one. Right? I'll talk a little bit later about Working Families for Wal-Mart, this major campaign that Wal-Mart helped to organize as it was being challenged by labor unions and other organizations around 2005, 2006. That's still active today in a different form. Go to walmartcommunity.com if you want to see what this looks like right now, where Walmart now has a major campaign that tries to support them in all the different cities where they're having battles to open new stores. They've saturated the rural markets. They're increasingly moving into urban markets, and they're having more and more battles there. And so they work with local community organizations and sometimes create their own to help their interests in those cities. WellPoint, the health insurer, had its health action network during health reform. The fracking companies have United Shale Advocates, a grassroots campaign to try to support fracking. The smoking companies, right, the tobacco companies are heavily involved in this. In the 90s, if you actually go back to the UC San Francisco tobacco legacy documents, you can actually dig all of this up. They created, Philip Morris created the National Smokers Alliance, R.J. Reynolds created the Partisan Movement. When the tobacco industry was in battle, they couldn't just rely on lobbying. They felt like they needed smokers to actually be working with them, especially fighting back against the regulation on smoking in bars and restaurants. Today, there's Altria, which Philip Morris became, which has its Citizens for Tobacco Rights campaign. That one's still active. There's been major battles about soda, including a huge battle in the Bay Area just this past fall. There are organizations like American Against Food Taxes that are working with grocers and beverage companies to try to fight back against soda taxes and things like that. Sometimes companies have their own campaigns. Best Buy has its Blue Grassroots network, which often tries to fight back against taxes on technology. Econ4U is a campaign of the payday lenders. So another controversial industry. Harrah's, the gambling company, has its Winning Together campaign. And one of the most fascinating campaigns of all, Citizens for Fire Safety. This is actually a campaign that was a front for the flame retardant chemical manufacturers, which actually created this campaign to work with fire marshals and others, saying that our products help stop fires. Let's do what we can to try to get their support. And if you want a really great example of this, there's a fantastic documentary called Toxic Hot Seat that talks about the Citizens for Fire Safety campaign, and there's a nice Chicago Tribune series on this as well that won Pulitzer. So what I'll talk about as we go on today are a few things connected to my book. One is, how did the changes in the business environment and the civic environment help to bring about these kinds of practices? Professional grassroots lobbying campaigns or public affairs campaigns mobilized with the support of consultants. And how has that come about since the 1970s? I'll also talk a bit about which firms do this, which firms engage in these kinds of campaigns, which firms don't find it necessary to do that. And we'll talk a bit toward the end about the consequences. What are the consequences for the businesses that do this? And what are the consequences for public participation? So just a brief outline. I'll talk about my motivation, my approach, the context of how the field is formed, a little bit about the market, and a little bit about the outcomes as I go on. I'm just going to touch on these just all very briefly as we go on. So what got me interested in this in the first place was thinking about the way public participation has changed in the last few generations. There's been this puzzle that a lot of sociologists and political scientists have been curious about, which is, how is it that we have this incredibly expanding advocacy sector, right? With the per capita adjusted number of national advocacy groups that we have in this country, more than doubling between 1970 and the early 2000s. What Jack Walker had called the advocacy explosion, Jeff Berry and Frank Gumbrunner and others have talked about. Yet we also have these trends toward declining participation, right? Fewer and fewer people seem to be overall involved in the process. And it does seem that we've got this system in which the advocacy field is transforming in some really important ways, where we've got sort of more advocacy but fewer advocates, if you will. And so one of the things that gets talked about here is, what are the sources of this and what are the consequences of it? The way that the sources discussion usually goes is, well, changes in American government regulation, the rise of the regulatory state, changes in the way policy in Congress is made with more openness since the 1970s, these so-called sunshine laws. And then the 60s activist groups being incorporated into the political system. There's also a sort of major change that happened during this time. I think we know a lot about the sources of that. We thought, I think, not sufficiently enough about the consequences of it, right? How does a changing advocacy sector influence other kinds of things? How does it relate to the ways that businesses engage in advocacy? Because a major thing that started to happen was in the 1970s, these advocacy groups became more and more active on a variety of different issues, particularly the Nader groups and the consumer movement. And business was nowhere near as involved in the political process at the time before that. business was increasingly threatened by a lot of the changes that were coming along, and they needed a way to respond to this new advocacy context. And so what I became interested in was how the shifting advocacy environment helped to kind of commercialize public participation, whether we see more and more of this kind of participation that's coming directly from business interests, funded by business interests, and other kinds of professional advocacy causes. And a lot of the participation today is very transactional, right? Fill out this form letter, sign this petition. It's not the kind of thick community ties that one might imagine for public participation and other kinds of settings. And so how do I do this? I look at how this came about through the development of these private firms. These, what I call professional grassroots lobbying firms or public affairs consulting firms. And so it's worth it to just go through a brief definition. They are a professional consulting firm. They're a service provider. And they do this by contracting with organizational clients. They do occasionally work with individuals. Sometimes very wealthy individuals will hire them over land use battles, trying to build extensions onto their houses and things. But for the most part, it's organizations that are hiring them. Companies, advocacy groups, sometimes political parties. They incentivize public participation. They make it easier for people to participate in the political process by giving them information about issues that they might care about, telling them who their legislator is, sometimes helping them with technology. They target particular members of the public. They're not just sending out broadcasts all the time. They're usually going after specific individuals and groups who they believe will be sympathetic to their cause. But they often do this in a kind of careful way that I'll talk about. They have to balance out the interest in getting people involved who are likely to say yes. Those are the people who are already involved in the process, who are already overrepresented in the political system. Yet they also usually want to build a more diverse seeming coalition for the organization that's working for them. So that kind of pushes in a slightly different direction. They use information and communication technologies very widely. My consultants wanted to talk with, I call them my consultants, like they're my people now. This project, I feel like they're a little bit. They very much are active in talking about Facebook and Twitter and how new communications technologies are really reshaping the participatory landscape. Just like they were very active in doing things like blast faxing and satellite kinds of communications years ago. And of course, mailing lists, mail merge kinds of strategies in the 1970s were a very big deal for them as well. Their targets are heterogeneous. Sometimes they're targeting legislation. Sometimes they're targeting administrative policy during public comment periods. Ballot campaigns are a major part of this. A lot of them do signature gathering for ballot campaigns. And sometimes they are just trying to move the needle of public opinion. Or even sometimes they try to change another company's practices. There's often these contentious negotiations between healthcare providers and insurers, for example. Similar kinds of things happen in cable companies between the cable companies themselves and then the providers of the content, where they often do these cross-lobbying campaigns with the other organizations. So that's also represented here, although I won't talk about it as much today. Just sort of simply, and we can talk about more details if people are interested in Q&A later. How did I go about doing this? I got really lucky in finding this set of listings in Campaigns and Elections magazine, which is the central clearinghouse for political professional services. I aggregated all of those listings over about a 15-year period, boiled that down to a set of 712 unique firms that were active at some point between 1990 and 2004. I used that to track the founding of these consulting firms over time. So that's how I understand the formation of the field. I also used the client lists of the consultants on their own websites, which I used for understanding the market, who it is that's hiring these consultants. And then the third major source of this is a series of surveys and interviews that I did with these consultants using some funding I got from the National Science Foundation to try to understand what are the strategies they use to mobilize the public, who and how do they target people, and what are the kinds of outcomes they have in shaping policy. And so, how did the field get formed? Well, there were a couple suspicions I had about why it was that we saw this major wave of foundings of these new grassroots lobbying firms in the 1970s and especially into the 1980s. Of course, it continued on after that, but there was a bit of market saturation later. I was kind of interested in a couple things. I mean, one, how did the expansion of the advocacy sector and this so-called advocacy explosion that I talked about a moment ago affect the founding of these firms? certainly it seemed if you read the business history of that time, books by people like David Fogel, they talked a lot about how the business political mobilization of the public, especially in the late 1970s, into the early 1980s, was really about business feeling like it was on the defensive from all sides, right? I mean, there's these new regulatory agencies like EPA and OSHA, which are regulating them more. But on top of that, there was a active environmental movement, active consumer movement, who were targeting them, filing lawsuits against them. Business felt like it was on the defensive from the rising citizen movement and citizen organizations at that time. So I thought that might have some relationship to the founding of these firms, in which the firms are then adopting the strategies of the advocacy groups. I also thought that the political mobilization of business was a really important part of this. We know that the post-1973 period was a major period of new business activism, what some people call the new corporate activism of that time and in the years since. I also thought that a more partisan public should be more receptive to these kinds of messages. As people's partisan affiliations seem to move further and further apart, that should have some influence on people's receptivity to these kinds of campaigns. Some have suggested that the rise of grassroots lobbying had to do with the conservative shift in government. The political consultant Richard Vickery has talked about this and talked about how the mass mailing technologies essentially were very, very good at helping Republicans in around the time that this major wave of founding was happening. And of course, the transformation of civic engagement, I thought, might have some relationship. And so here's just a basic trend in foundings of new grassroots lobbying firms over this time period from the early 1970s up to around 2002. And you do see what organizational ecologists would expect to see here, where you see the growth of a field with some bandwagon effects as time goes on, reaching essentially some inversion point in which you start to see some evidence of market saturation, in which there's a whole lot of these firms that are all competing over the same market. And so this inverted U curve is somewhat expected. And you do see a substantial rise of this in the late 70s into the early 1980s, in which a number of these trends were converging. We can layer that over with trends of founding of new advocacy groups and founding of new trade associations. The data on advocacy groups comes from Frank's Policy Agendas Project, the Encyclopedia of Organizations. The trade associations data comes from Lynn Spillman, who's used similar directory sources to understand business associations. And you do see at least some evidence of a trend in advocacy groups founding, at least preceding this, as well as an upward trend in trade associations. And so when I talked to the consultants about this, it was kind of interesting to hear what they would say. So this is from an interview with one of the very first consultants in this field who founded his firm in the mid-1970s. So he says, in the early 70s, I was a consultant on conventional political campaigns. But that's very cyclical, right? It's lots of peaks and valleys in your revenue. This is a very, very common story that I heard among the long-standing consultants. Since my family started, we needed to level off the peaks and valleys. So I began to dabble around with the grassroots. And of course, grassroots means the sort of awkward use of grassroots that I'm using here and not the definition that you came into the room with. It was just back in the 70s, and it was need that was the mother of invention. And he continues on. The politics were also changing for industry, right? So there was a supply side and this demand side factor here. There were two issues. One was tobacco, the other one was nuclear. These were highly controversial issues, and they were major. And this sort of supported some of my hunch and some of what David Fogel said as well. After the 60s, the corporate interests saw the effectiveness of group participation, right? They said, well, if they can do it, so can we, right? Companies noticed the unions and how they were organizing as well, and so they said, why not? Let's go out there and buy. And I see this also in my models. The explosion of advocacy groups seem to have a significant association with the founding of these new grassroots lobbying firms when I look at this in disaggregated panel models. The political mobilization of business also seemed to have an effect, an even stronger effect over time. And I also see some effect in which a more partisan public seemed to be receptive to these campaigns and much more active in helping to found these organizations. I don't really find much of an effect of the other two, the rightward shift in American politics or declining civic engagement. So the transformation of the advocacy sector really did help to bring about, it seems, some new sort of transformations in the political system with the development of these firms over time. In terms of the market, it's sort of interesting to break it down, I think. Individual firms are a plurality of their clients. 29% of their clients are businesses. Another 10% are trade associations. So you get to about 39% of their total client base are either individual firms or groups of firms. A certain amount of them, you can see here, right, 26% are electoral campaigns. And I think this reflects, in fact, the history here, where a lot of these consultants actually came out of electoral campaigns. They kept holding on to their earlier electoral clients and then added on some of these other kinds of business clients. And a lot of them do continue to get out the vote kinds of efforts and constituent targeting for those kinds of efforts. Interestingly, advocacy groups themselves hire these firms. A surprising number of advocacy groups, 18% of their total client base, the consultants, are themselves, right, these kinds of citizens groups who outsource a certain amount of their office activity to these consulting firms. I talked a lot about this in the book in chapter 6, where you see a wide variety of organizations doing this. I mean, sometimes the Tea Party organizations have been doing this. Of course, they've had a lot of business support for their efforts all along. You also see a lot of progressive groups, National Council of La Raza, big national Washington advocacy groups do quite a lot of this. And they are mostly more Washington-based, more professionalized, more wealthy organizations. This is not your local PTA who's doing this. Government agencies, surprisingly, do a certain amount of this. It's mostly at the local level, so like local water districts. Sometimes school boards hire this when they have bond issues they need to get approved. And labor unions, but only the very biggest national labor unions are doing this. Some of the other clients are kind of interesting. Sometimes universities do this, sometimes foundations do it. Looking at the firms that are the most likely to do this in the Fortune 500, I think you see a kind of interesting mix. You see certainly a number of telecoms, Comcast, Verizon, Motorola, firms that face major public controversies pretty regularly, like Wal-Mart, are in there. Pharmaceuticals like Merck, Lilly, and Pfizer, all highly represented there. These are all the firms that appeared on at least 5 of these different consulting firms' membership or constituent lists. And you certainly see a number of other companies that have faced controversies in their public relations. What I did was I looked at the firms that had survived to 2010. So 24% of the firms that were in my original data had survived to 2010. Of those 171 firms, 71% listed some or all of their clients on their website in 2010. And what I did was aggregate their client lists up and look for the counts of times that they appeared on consultants' client lists at this time. So it's a slice, a cross-sectional slice to try to look at this. And the findings were I think kind of interesting. 40% of the Fortune 500 show up on at least one of these consulting firms' client lists. So this is not an activity that's unfamiliar to major corporations in the U.S. We're talking about quite a number of firms that are doing this, concentrated among some of the most powerful companies in the U.S. And looking at the factors that differentiate the hiring from the non-hiring firms, it is the highly regulated industries that are among the most likely. So you do see a lot of this in energy, you see a lot of this in telecommunications, companies that face major government regulation. Companies that have crises or controversies in their public relations do this, particularly when they're very threatening to the industry. Signs that they've been doing things that are hazardous to the environment, signs that they have scandals in their marketing are often the companies that do this, and the companies that face major protests are much more likely to do this. But what I found interesting is that it also turns out that the business's reputational standing seems to also be a factor here. Where the firms that have high reputations, they still do a substantial amount of this, but it's really among the low reputation firms that you see these strong effects of controversies, strong effects of protests, where they feel severely threatened, because they're in essentially a weaker position within their industry, such that when these controversies or protests come along, they feel like they need to respond much more forcefully by bringing on these consultants that can help them mobilize the public to help fight back against protests or against threatened regulations or unwelcome legislation. In terms of the outcomes for business, I think it's interesting to compare a couple of cases here. One is the case of Working Families for Wal-Mart, which I started to mention before, that I think helps to understand the outcomes a bit further. In 2005, Wal-Mart was facing just a huge number of problems. This was actually a peak period of protest against Wal-Mart. There's this great database by Sprawlbusters. It's an activist group that actually is very careful in how they document individual protests against Wal-Mart. It's been used in a number of studies in top journals. You can look at the trend in Sprawlbusters' protests against Wal-Mart in 2005, which was just an absolute peak over the last about 15 years. Wal-Mart was having problems in local communities. They were getting negative attention from labor unions. They were being called out because a lot of their employees have to take public benefits because they aren't compensated well enough. And their effects on small businesses and harming small business was also coming up as a major problem for them. And so the two separate unions start these major national campaigns against Wal-Mart during this time. SEIU creates its anti-Walmart campaign called Walmart Watch, and the United Food and Commercial Workers started their WakeUpWalmart.com campaign. And these were really full-throated efforts to try to challenge the company to get them to provide better benefits and to stop threatening the unions as much as they were. Of course, on top of all of this, the company was getting reported for seeming to push employees out of certain employment categories so that they wouldn't have to pay the benefits, with major reports in the New York Times coming out around this period. And so Walmart had this situation. They needed to respond in a really substantial way, but they felt like they couldn't just rely on conventional lobbying. And so they put out essentially a call for proposals. Three of the consulting firms in my data all replied, and Edelman, this massive PR firm that increasingly does grassroots efforts like this, gets hired by Wal-Mart, and they create a full-on war room in Bentonville, Arkansas, ready to respond to all of these different issues that the company is facing. And importantly, they helped to create this organization called Working Families for Wal-Mart, which did not, at the outset, claim that it had substantial Wal-Mart funding. They actually went out of their way to say that Wal-Mart is really only one of the funders, and not even the primary funder. Of course, they didn't disclose where the funds were coming from, but that was a claim that they made. And they had this diverse, very diverse board of directors, including former civil rights movement leader Andrew Young. They sat out front of Walmart storefronts and canvassed the shoppers and tried to get them to sign on to petitions and join their campaign. They pressured their suppliers very heavily to write letters to support them when they're facing these negative regulations in a number of cities. They went after the union critics. If you take a look, the great and the bad thing about the internet is that nothing ever goes away, right? So you could go to the Internet Archive and take a look at the Working Families for Wal-Mart website, as well as the campaign that they organized against the union groups called Paid Critics, that actually went out and tried to smear the union leaders personally and say nasty things about their reputations. They created this Walmarting Across America RV tour, apparently. This is a very schlucky kind of thing.
Teach that in our ethics classes. It's extremely bad, unethical public.
I've heard that it's been used like that in communications and journalism courses.
Well, because it is extremely bad.
Well, I'm not disputing you on that. That's right. And of course, as you know, it turned out that essentially this was the sibling of, if I recall correctly, an Edelman senior executive who was one of the two Walmart's, the RV tour leaders going across America. They were directly tied to the campaign. So this was very widely discredited, right? They wanted to make it seem as if Walmart's this kind of folksy place where you can go and park your RV there overnight, and that they've got this great sort of community feel to the things that they're doing. And the extent of their support was not disclosed. Of course, it later came out that Working Families for Wal-Mart was, of course, entirely funded by Walmart. They were not just one of the funders, they were the only funder. Now, I want to keep that case in mind as a serious fail case, right, in which campaigns like this really did not work out for the companies that were sponsoring it. Now, an interesting case I think to compare this to is the controversy surrounding Canadian National Railways. And a few years ago, Canadian National was interested in purchasing a stretch of railway going around the Chicago suburbs. If you take a look at this map, the gray lines are Canadian National's existing holdings. And the red lines are the holdings that they hope to acquire. These used to be held by the Elgin Joliet and Eastern Railway. And Canadian National was concerned because Chicago is a major transit hub. If you want to get rail traffic through the Midwest, you almost always have to go through Chicago. And these existing rail lines were just completely gridlocked. We're talking about something like 20 of these long freight trains coming through each given day. And the idea was that they wanted to route more of these around the suburbs so that they wouldn't be affecting these communities as well, and so that they could get their traffic through a little bit more easily. And not surprisingly, you see major protests start to mount among people who live in these suburban areas, who are threatened by the fact that they only have about 5 trains going through a day. The threat was that they would have 20 or 25 trains going through these surface crossings in their backyards. And these are relatively well-off people in suburbs like Barrington, Illinois. Here's a quote from one of the community members. The old houses in our community won't be standing for very long because they're going to be shaking right off their foundations. The noise is already intolerable. I can't imagine what 20 trains a day will be like. And so there were a series of public hearings. Of course, this deal needed to get approved by the Surface Transportation Board. And suburban not-in-my-backyard activism was just a major force here. People were coming out to these events in such a large scale that they were overflowing school auditoriums where they were holding the hearings. Really a very substantial force. And like what we know about other not-in-my-backyard campaigns, I mean, people were threatened with the loss of their community. Right? They thought that something really fundamental was going to change. The property values would decline. Their kids would be stuck in the rain waiting for school buses and things like this. And so what did Canadian National do? Well, it took a different strategy than Wal-Mart did when it was facing its controversies. And this is a quote from one of the consulting firms that I interviewed who told me about their work on behalf of Canadian National to try to get this deal approved. They say, well, we started calling the residents who live in these Southside Chicago neighborhoods who would stand to benefit from the rail volume declining in their backyards. And what they did was ask people, well, what do you think about this, right? How do you feel about the possibility that the number of trains coming through would decrease? And they start collecting those anecdotes that people say over the phone. We asked them why they care, and then they took those anecdotes and they essentially packaged the letter for them. The consultants then took those anecdotes, put them together in letter form, and essentially came back to those individuals saying, can we send this letter on your behalf, right? Or will you be willing to send this letter? And it's interesting, there's always this question of how we draw the line between grassroots and astroturf, right? Real grassroots versus fake participation. And that's something that this field always faces, right? What is real, authentic participation, independent of the state and the market, versus what is participation that's strictly driven by those kinds of established interests. And the way that they draw the line here is consistent with the way a lot of the other consultants try to draw the line. They say, we're not astroturfing, right? We're getting people's authentic views out there, right? We're helping them. The cut and paste campaigns, I think they have in mind the sort of MoveOn.org kind of mass letter writing or petitioning campaigns where people send on form letters. That's astroturf, right? And they see that as not effective, but the kinds of things that they do, they see as much more authentic. And so comparing these two cases, I think it's interesting in that both faced really strong opposition. They had elite allies, right? Connections to people in positions of political power. And they both worked with consultants to try to win their campaigns. Edelman in the case of Wal-Mart, and then this group that I'll call for purposes of presentation, Grassroots Advocates Company, that helped with the Canadian National campaign. And what's interesting is that Canadian National was much more transparent about its role. When they went out to call people in these communities, one of the first things they said was, we're calling on behalf of Canadian National. And we'd like to let you know that we think you might share some interest with us. But in the Wal-Mart campaign, it was much different, right? There was really very little transparency, very little acknowledgement that Wal-Mart was behind it. In fact, an active effort to try to masquerade as something else. We've seen something very similar lately in the campaign in the Bay Area against the soda tax. Some of you might have been following these two campaigns, one in San Francisco and one in Berkeley, in which there was an effort to put a 2 or 3 cent soda tax on each large bottle of soda sold. And you see this coalition come about, calling itself a Coalition for an Affordable City, making it seem as if the organization is mainly about like the rising rent in San Francisco. They had one issue and only one issue, it was the soda tax. And there was very, very little disclosure about the fact that this was almost entirely an American Beverage Association campaign. And I think for similar reasons, they had major problems in getting this to work. Wal-Mart's campaign was much more easily discredited as AstroTurf because it was lacking in disclosure and it failed to develop an independent base of support. So thinking about not only how this matters for businesses, but how does this matter for participation, going to the survey data of the consultants, what I did was look at what did the consultants say they devoted the most effort to? Which social groups did they say they devoted the most effort to in the past 2 years? Which groups did they target primarily? Which groups were a secondary target? And this data combines the groups that they say was either a primary or a secondary target. I don't actually see a lot of difference in terms of income, in terms of who it is that they participate, they target for participation. College educated, they targeted, where they were more likely to target. Really one of the most important factors are these people already involved in politics? Right? Are these people who are known to be active? Because they, as rational actors, they don't want to be wasting their clients' money. They want to make it such that if they're going to be recruiting people, those people are going to be the ones who are likely to say yes. This is the kind of supply-side recruitment that we've seen in a lot of sociological and political science work, where you go after the people most likely to say yes. Political activists, civic activists, people who are highly partisan, who probably don't need that much work to be swayed to support their issue. Likely voters. Interestingly, minority groups are also a major part of their targeting. And I've seen in campaign after campaign really a troubling amount of tokenism that happens in these campaigns. And this actually shows up in the data when I disaggregate the primary target versus the secondary target. Oftentimes the minority groups are the secondary target in this campaign, where they'll say, we want to go after the people who are highly active in the political system, who are highly educated, who are likely to say yes and write a letter on behalf of us or whatever it is that we want them to do. But we also are looking to have this kind of diverse coalition. And so there's really a troubling amount of tokenism that takes place in these kinds of campaigns. And so just to wrap up, what I find is that the growth in these kinds of practices has a lot to do with a more politically mobilized business sector. It has to do with the changing organization of civic life and the rise of a much larger advocacy population in the US, and a much more partisan public. The companies that do this the most are those that are majorly threatened by serious regulations and controversies. And we've seen this lately not only in the beverage industry, we've seen it in the for-profit colleges, we've seen it in the tanning bed industry, another industry that faces major kinds of controversies on a regular basis. Vitamin D claims be damned. And it's other companies that are facing major regulatory threats that seem to do this the most. It seems to be most effective when companies are more transparent about who's behind them. There still is a way for companies to do these kinds of campaigns while still not facing the charge of AstroTurf. There is a way that companies can do this in a more, I would say, responsible way in which they disclose who they're working for and why their interests might or might not align with certain citizen groups. This has been happening in a number of industries. For better or worse, Monsanto has been doing an incredible amount of this. They've got this campaign to get GMO products approved called America's Farmers, and you can go and Google America's Farmers and take a look at this campaign. What's really interesting is there's a study that just came out of USC Marshall Business School that showed that the regulators are essentially much more likely to approve the deal if it seems to have some third-party advocacy coming from farmers rather than directly from the companies that are providing GMO products. So that having this kind of independent constituency, right, an arm's length arrangement between the ultimate sponsor and the constituency may be helpful, and that transparency can help in some ways. The recruitment and targeting of activists by these campaigns is changing public participation, I think, in a lot of ways. It's the kinds of participation that they are encouraging is much more transactional. It's not developing the kind of thick social ties that we usually think of as linked to participation. I mean, to put a finer point on it, we could actually even say that you've got participation without social capital in many ways here, and we usually think that those things go together. The selective targeting of activists by these campaigns are also making for a more unequal political system in which the people who are already overrepresented in the process are being selected for activism by these campaigns. They might shift over on issues, but nonetheless, these are people who are already very active in the political system. With some exceptions, of course, they're also looking for diversity, but that's a lesser priority. These practices are giving businesses new ways to influence the political system. With 40% of the Fortune 500 doing this, I think it's really an underappreciated part of the politics of the corporation. You think about the big debates that are happening about corporate America today, they're not as much around these kinds of practices. They're much more around political action committees and conventional lobbying spending. Those things are easier to track, but they're all really only part of the picture. Increasingly, business treats itself as social movement-like in nature, and they know that they need to win this battle over hearts and minds in many cases in order to have an effect. And so this is contributing to political inequality, I'd say, making for transactional civic engagement. And I think this project in many ways leads us to rethink a number of things. It leads us to new conclusions about how we want to think about participation, new ways of thinking about the business and the corporate sector as a political actor, and about how we're thinking about inequality today. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Questions?
It was a surprising number to me that only 40% of Fortune 500 companies are doing that. I really doubt that.
You think it's more?
I think it's way more.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
It
just
may
so
not
I'm only
appear
looking
in a
at.
form that showed up for you.
I'm sorry.
It may not appear in a form that showed up for you.
Sure. I mean, so if we look at much broader kind of public relations strategies that don't involve mobilizing mass participation, then absolutely. You know, the firms that I'm looking at are ones that claim to be very active in mobilizing mass participation, and not just doing it in a sort of limited kind of way. So there are some firms out there that are just vendors of data. And do just very simple kinds of services, but they don't actually help their corporate clients strategize about how they're going to mobilize the mass public. So I'm really only looking at those firms. But on another level, there are certain firms that just don't have that much of a need to engage the public all that much. I mean, you think about the companies that make bubble wrap. The companies that do like B2B, like where most of their products and services are being sold to other businesses. Their reputation relative to the public doesn't matter as much as like a big retail operation does, or a big manufacturing firm that actually has a lot of brand recognition. You look at a lot of the Fortune 500, they're not necessarily firms that are known. I mean, you go through that list and I'll bet most Americans don't know at least half of them by name. And some of them have huge recognition. I mean, a lot of the ones that I listed are firms that are household names. The telecoms in particular, I mean, people deal with all the time. I doubt any one of us doesn't have strong opinions about like Comcast or Time Warner or Verizon. These are firms that we not only know, but we think we know well. And it turns out they actually know us really well. It's a scary part. And another thing I should mention here is that a lot of them do, they use the data that they have to help target certain audiences. I mean, the companies like Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint they're constantly battling local communities over things like siting of cell phone towers. And they're highly regulated, so they often find the need to mobilize the mass public in a pretty substantial way. Yeah, Frank?
Well, let me give you an example to ask you, how do you make the distinction, or how should we make the distinction between a kind of unethical use of maybe a diverse constituency as a front for a corporate interest, and something that is a true shared interest?
Yeah.
So the example I would give you is a case that came up in a book I did 2009, where Verizon and the long-distance phone companies were trying to eliminate what's called the 3% excise tax on long-distance phone charges, which I found out in the research came from the Spanish-American War, when long-distance phone service was a luxury, and it's been on your phone bill ever since then. And so Well, Mexican Americans make a lot of long distance phone calls and a lot of international phone calls, and so disproportionately they pay a higher percentage of their income in this tax. And so the long distance companies use them, you could say, as a front, but they created a diverse coalition. They got MALDEF and they got all the Mexican American community organizations, all of them, but to participate in this lobbying effort to reduce or eliminate the tax. And it ended up almost coming to fruition, and then the budget deficit went like crazy, and so then it was off the agenda to eliminate any taxes. But I didn't have the sense that that was some unethical, crazy using situation, although it came close because they wanted to eliminate the tax for other reasons.
Were they transparent?
I think so. You know, man, it's true that, foreigner, immigrant communities use long distance phone a lot.
I mean, so in the book, I talk about 3 criteria that can be used to help distinguish this. One is the criterion of masquerading, which I think the Working Families for Wal-Mart campaign is probably my clearest example.
Is that the kind of thing you were looking at, Rhonda?
Yes, where they were lying. They weren't just not, they were lying.
That's right.
And specifically saying, we had nothing to do with this.
That's right.
And that's bad, obviously bad, but we argue in ethics that it's actually your ethical duty to disclose. Now, that doesn't mean you have to fly over the beach with a banner, but that you disclose,
It's there.
in a regular way, on a website or
Well,
something.
but, it's interesting though, I want to come back to that list in a minute, but if you see a lot of these campaigns, there is disclosure in a very basic, limited way. You could go to that Coalition for an Affordable Cities website and you could look and see it in the fine print of the Marcellus Shale Coalition. You can see that this is a project of the natural gas industry, or the other one's a project of the beverage industry. But it's usually in the fine print at the bottom of the page. And if you look at they almost always on these kinds of campaigns, they have a community co-sponsors list on there. And almost without fail, you don't see a dominant representation of people who are directly connected to the industry. I mean, sometimes you see this, but a lot of times they really try to weight it with the beverage industry. It's local grocers. It's the people who work at the bottling plant. I mean, that they even try to play those down sometimes. So there's disclosure, and then there's disclosure. I guess is the answer there. But I'd say the masquerading thing is one. The other one is, I mean, you'd be surprised how much forgery and outright fraud happens in these campaigns. I mean, it's not incredibly common, but you look at some of these campaigns by Rick Berman, the lobbyist who's often called Dr. Evil, who 60 Minutes did a profile on a couple of years ago. A lot of times he's working through these kinds of front organizations, and sometimes they're actively, sort of forging letters. There was a scandal a few years ago with the coal industry. There was this trade group, Americans for Clean Coal Energy, that had worked with one of the consultants in my study to essentially to forge letters on behalf of the NAACP, making it seem as if they were in favor of these kind of regulations on coal that they wanted. That outright fraud actually happens. That to me is a clear marker. But the third is actually the one that actually raises the most ambiguity, which is heavy incentives, right? Giving people anything from direct payment. Sometimes people are paid to show up at protest events. They'll put an ad up on Craigslist and pay people $20 an hour to come out to a protest event. They'll give them very strict media training before they go and tell them not to talk to anyone, but just keep repeating the message. These get found out later. Those kinds of incentive issues, that one's clear, but giving people a shopper's rewards card, or these kind of more general like lobbying incentives, like the incentive to be heard by your member of Congress, that's where you start to get into a gray area where it looks just like resource mobilization for just about any other kind of advocacy organization, where every advocacy organization tries to incentivize people to get involved in the process and make it easier for them. It's just that's where it's really more of an issue of the sort of scale and scope of it that happens in this field. So I'd say, masquerading, the forgery issue, and the incentives issue are all considerations that I tend to make here. And of course, forgery and fraud being the one that has the most obvious ethical implications. Yeah.
Still about the, one could imagine, maybe you could say more about what the purchasers of these goods expect, and maybe better is, in this room you would probably not get anybody to say that Families for Wal-Mart is going to be an independent organization.
Yeah.
I expect if you go to the halls of Congress or to any city council, they'll have the same sort of skepticism. So I'm wondering to what extent this it's not astroturf,
Yeah.
this gardening in public opinion, has an impact of any sort?
Yeah.
It must in some ways, but
I think
say more about
That's right. I mean, the cases like Working Families for Walmart, you're right. I mean, I think people's default assumption is that this is probably a front, and that's a really high risk thing for firms to be doing. But there are a lot of other cases that where a large part of what they're doing is trying to make partnership with independent civic organizations that happen to have an interest in this. I mean, I talked about the Monsanto case, where this America's Farmers campaign seems to have been actually quite effective in their efforts to mobilize, and it's because it's a third-party effort that where it's I think they are acknowledging that they're a part of it, but at the same time the farmers have their own independent interest in this that seems to be separate from that. But there are a number of other cases too where you do see that there's some effort to disclose, some effort to talk about who's behind it, that I think makes people understand that the citizens' interests are actually reasonably well aligned with the client's interests. That was certainly the case in the Canadian National case.
So if you're I'm just curious about this. Let's assume that everybody's pretty sophisticated about this. There are going to be some people who are not.
Right.
And so they discovered there are people who would like to have those trainings rather than someone else's neighborhood. And so the commission is making decisions.
Right.
Okay, you've generated some people who don't like that. It's also balanced against people who are coming out who are filling auditoriums.
Yeah.
Does that have an impact? Do we know? Or
Well, it was interesting in the Canadian National case that not only did the deal get approved, but it got approved using a lot of the language that the consultants were advocating and that were getting repeated by the advocacy organizations. I mean, to me, I'm sure there was a lot of considerations here, including this is, after all, a federal agency that's thinking about the best thing for the entire transportation grid for the United States, and not just what's good for a bunch of suburban activists. But it seems to me that these cases do actually have some effect on influencing policy. Especially when it's both transparent, but the interest is somewhat independent. When you see musicians advocating on behalf of the record labels, I mean, it's a similar kind of story. Where labor unions trying to change some kind of corporate tax policy. That kind of distance does generate a certain amount of political authenticity.
So you were citing organizations with reputation problems or kind of regulation problems seem to be the highest end. Within sectors, could you clarify the reputation in terms of, I know they were just graphics, but you had like a Verizon. Within a sector like that, is there any differences between a Verizon and
Sure, I can tell you about that. I've got a little supplement here. Sorry, I'm going to have to race through about 50 supplemental slides here. Let's see, there we go. So you do see some differences among the firms who have been reasonably active in this. You see some high reputation firms, FedEx, Nike, GE, Walt Disney, and then other companies that have faced some major kinds of problems in their public relations. Obviously, most cores problems with their advertising. You see Waste Management, which also often has environmental concerns. Some low reputation telecom companies like Quest. And so, what you're talking about here, I like to distinguish between reputation and legitimacy, with legitimacy being the sort of basic things that make a firm or an organization acceptable. That's really a much more foundational kind of thing. Reputation is really about business, understanding the public that this is a distinctively high quality organization. And being involved in one of these campaigns, I mean, it does come with a different set of risks for a firm that's at the top of the reputational order versus a firm that's already having problems in its public relations. Doing this kind of full-throated campaign, if you're a really high reputation firm, and it comes out later that you were the sponsor of it, I think that comes with a different set of risks. The lower reputation firms, they don't have that sort of buffer, that protection, and often feel that they need to engage in a much more substantial kind of way when they face these protests or controversies. So I mean, it fits with a field theoretic approach that you'd find in sociology or organizational studies that talks about how reputation often, confers a symbolic advantage to organizations that affects the way they approach politics. Yes.
Do you teach people how to do this?
No.
Who does?
So the closest thing to that, there are two places where that happens. One is the Graduate School for Political Management in Washington. It's part of GWU, which actually does professional training on this. And then there's a freestanding think tank called the Washington Center in Washington, of course, that brings leading practitioners of this together. The other forum for this is the Public Affairs Council, which is the organization that brings together the leading public affairs officers of all the major companies as well as the consultants. They always meet in some sunny destination, usually in Florida, Hawaii, every year in January. I tried to go to it a number of times. They wouldn't let me. They don't seem to let journalists go either. But they're certainly exchanging some best practices, or what they see as best practices, at those meetings. And in fact, there's a Grassroots Innovation Award that they give every year, including some of the campaigns that I talked about, not the Wal-Mart one. But certainly they're exchanging notes and talking about what seems to work. And it does seem that they value transparency a bit in how they do this. I mean, I think their message is not hugely different from mine in terms of the problems associated with being relatively transparent.
And is the lack of transparency a problem because it doesn't work?
Well, I mean, it works in both ways, right? I mean, it's both the more ethical thing to do and it's the more effective thing to do. Is there another question?
I'm sorry.
I'll email you, I gotta go.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
What is the consequences of this professionalization of advocacy? And for example, that troubling thing you said about normal advocacy groups and companies buying the same services from the same companies.
Right.
How does that kind of work out? Because
Right.
I couldn't see an issue where the same company is working for both sides.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that in a lot of these Walmart campaigns, it's not the same consultant. I mean, they usually have conflict of interest policies where they try to avoid that kind of thing, and generally you don't see them playing both sides of it. They don't do the sort of realtor thing of representing both the buyer and the seller. But what they often do is that different consulting firms are working with each side. So the companies will hire their own consulting firm, and then the advocacy groups actually will hire a different consulting firm. And that was what's been happening in the Walmart effort to get into the New York City market lately, where the Walmart would hire really a whole series of consulting firms, and then the advocacy groups worked with this group in public affairs to try to bring their cause together and make sure that they were essentially able to keep up in this arms race, and that's what often happens. And so, the way I see it, I mean, advocacy groups are important not only for getting people who, aren't already active in the political process as mass members, but it's also important for the people who are involved in actually training them in civic skills and getting them to learn about how democracy is supposed to work. And when a lot of that requesting activity, shifts away from advocacy organizations and into these professional consultants trying to win a policy battle, I think it doesn't confer those kinds of skills in a meaningful way. It's really about finding the target demographic, figuring out who the swing voter is, and getting those particular people involved. I think it does transform the way the advocacy field works a bit. At the same time, I'm not sure I would say that this is necessarily harming normal advocacy groups in a really substantial way, as such. I think it's shifting the way a lot of advocacy comes about, and a lot of the requests that people get for participation are coming from these consulting firms. They're recruiting hundreds of thousands of people into these kinds of campaigns over time, and that number's large, but the kinds of things that people are doing are often very short-term and transactional, and don't extend beyond that individual campaign. Yeah.
The upside down U curve you showed.
Right.
That is new firms entering the field.
That's new
not
firms.
the activity.
That's right.
So if you showed a curve on the activity, probably it's.
Well, and there's evidence to support that in data from the Congressional Management Foundation and others, I mean, when you start to see the sort of volume of communications that Congress is receiving now, certainly the technology allows it to scale up, but certainly these firms are quite active in the process, and that seems to fit with what I'm seeing in terms of how many people they say they're contacting. Yeah, Frank.
You mentioned just briefly that ballot initiatives was one of the things. People have this idea that a ballot initiative is usually some bunch of students volunteering for Greenpeace and that kind of stuff, which is about a similar level of engagement as what you're talking about.
Oh, I mean, in terms of, yeah.
There's not a real difference in that short-term transaction.
That's right. Well, and getting a ballot measure qualified, I mean, it's mainly a signature matter.
Yeah, but but even in that area, isn't it true now that some large majority of all such ballot initiative drives are corporate rather than kind of citizen oriented?
I don't know the data, but I mean, living in California now, I'm certainly seeing a lot of this. I mean, you see a lot of these that are about sort of regulation of companies like PG&E. You see it around fracking. You see it around a lot of different contentious practices that are regulated by state governments. But you see it on other kinds of issues too. I mean, one of these consultants that works mainly with advocacy groups, has been active in some of the marijuana legislation that's been passing in a number of states lately.
But you can imagine the same in what are considered by national organizations to be inexpensive local things like the North Carolina Supreme Court. And you can see the money come in, and you can see it come into attorney general's races or various local election things, which are small potatoes for some of these big, not necessarily corporations, but trade associations of political groups.
Right. Yeah, and there's a certain amount of this that they'll do on their own rather than working with the consultants themselves. But the consultants are very good at doing things like paid signature gathering. They know where they're going to get the numbers in terms of foot traffic to get people to sign on to these kinds of campaigns. And one of the consultants I talked with in California, really put a fine point on it in saying that when we're trying to get people to sign up to qualify a ballot measure, they say, we don't even care if you really fully understand this at all, because all you're voting for right now and signing this is just getting it qualified. If you don't like it, vote it down in November. Which is probably not the strongest argument they could make. But that kind of thing is not uncommon in this field.
To follow the professionalization on the political side, those guys cluster.
Oh, absolutely.
They walk across the aisles.
Yeah, that's right. And most of the ones that are working for major corporations are not partisan. I should mention that.
So when you flashed up the screen, you had a quarter of the clients are in campaign.
That's right.
Are those either Republican or Democratic houses that are dabbling in the corporate stuff?
There's a lot of those. Most of the ones that have primarily corporate clients don't touch either side, and a lot of the ones that are working for the Fortune 500s are really not getting involved in either side's causes. But you do see some, and it fits with what you see in other sociological studies about partisanship of industry, where the Republicans you see a lot more with energy, the Democrats you see a lot more with telecom.
Do the houses sort that way?
I'm not sure I follow.
Well, I mean, these guys are going to be fighting each other over the years. Is there any structuring of the houses? So are some companies going to be working for telecoms, other companies working for polluters, or I'm not making this up. Is there any sorting of the firms, or do they just have all clients right across the board?
Is there any sorting of the consulting firms in terms of industries? Right, and so you do see a certain amount of that where, I mean, at the same time, I have to say that the competitive dynamics of firms within industry limit that, right? Because if you're working with a particular consulting firm, you're not going to necessarily refer your top competitive rival to the same consulting firm. But you do see some general clustering around particular kinds of issues. Some of these consulting firms specialize in like contentious land uses and development kinds of issues, and so they're working with a lot of different real estate firms, but real estate firms all across the country who probably aren't in competition with one another. I don't think I've ever seen a case where I've seen FedEx and UPS working for the same consulting firm. Or Nike and Reebok working for the same one. I mean, the direct competitors, you don't really see a lot of that happening.
I'm just curious, just from the organization point of view.
Yeah.
talking about professional organizations with public opinion here. And the question is, are the organizers organized or are they self-organized in some ways?
Oh, sure. So there are trade associations for the grassroots lobbyists, if that's the question.
Well, it's more interesting than what I was asking.
Okay, yeah. So you do actually see some of these. There's one called I think it's called Innovate to Participate. There's the Public Affairs Council certainly plays some part of this role, and a lot of them are also connected to those trading institutes that I mentioned. So they, but there's not a whole lot of collective action in this industry. I mean, the closest thing that there was to collective action on behalf of this industry was after the Abramoff scandal. There was a proposal in the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act to regulate these kinds of firms in terms of making them disclose who the clients were if they were doing a really substantial amount of lobbying in a given quarter. After all, that was one of the scandals that helped bring Abramoff down, was doing this on behalf of Native American casinos. And what was interesting is that not only did all of the grassroots lobbying firms get together to try to oppose this because it would have really substantially changed their industry, but then you saw all these big national advocacy organizations who are opposed to it too. The purpose of disclosure is for that citizens to know about government, not for government to know about citizens. And so you saw the Right to Life groups, the Traditional Values Coalition, as well as like the ACLU and some big liberal organizations too, that were all opposed to this because the same rules that would have applied to these grassroots lobbying consultants would have affected all those big national advocacy groups.
In a lot of literature on the crisis of democratic representation, grassroots movement are seen as kind of like one of the answers to make governments more accountable, citizens more participative.
That's right.
in politics. So how does that very professional way of using grassroots affect our understanding of grassroots movement as an answer to the problems of
That's right.
the recent problems of democracy, especially in the Western world?
I mean, I think part of the answer is that we have an overly idealistic view of the way politics works to begin with. That these kinds of campaigns are the next step. That there's always been a certain amount of professionalization and advocacy. There's always been an effort to try to get your people organized on behalf of all kinds of different issues. I mean, before this industry was around, there were efforts by the insurance industry and other industries to try to blast people with telegraphs. I mean, this is Whitaker and Baxter in the 1930s, starting Campaigns Inc. had been doing this for some time now. If you're really interested in this theme more broadly, I have an edited volume that just came out called Democratizing Inequalities that gets us thinking a lot more about how participation can be assumed to be this always empowering kind of pro-democratic strategy for organizations and governments. Where I think what we're seeing now is a lot more participation that doesn't necessarily try to change society or doesn't necessarily try to ameliorate inequalities in any kind of vast way. Dan Grace has a very nice chapter in the volume, another reason to take a look at it. But I think what we need to do is also kind of rethink what we mean by participation and not assume that participation is always going to be the solution to all of our problems.
I guess the big question, I mean, like that, I'm trying to wrap my head around, and I've heard a number of questions here. It's like, does this phenomenon really since the 1970s that you're charting change in some fundamental way the structure of American democracy, right? So whether that's counted on sort of what legislative outcomes happen, what policy outcomes happen, what regulatory outcomes happen, or just the balance of power among different competing forces. Like, do you have that big picture? I mean, yes, in some ways this is an old phenomenon, as you're suggesting.
Right.
In other ways, you're suggesting this is qualitatively new.
Right.
But everyone's also doing it, so like, what does it all add up to in sort of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are scale and scope shifts that are quantitative that I think become qualitative shifts into a new model of participation. And on the one hand, a lot of these trends have been there all along. Where there's always been an effort by industry groups to make it seem as if their support is much broader than it is, or to work with community organizations and other kinds of groups to build a coalition around their issues. But What I would say is that the fact that this is happening with a full professional industry behind it that did not exist before, that is doing this on an incredibly large scale, such that the way that a lot of people are encountering the democratic process is through these kinds of transactional efforts. I mean, I think that does change things in a really qualitative way and really does transform the meaning of democracy in America, where you're talking about things that are much more short-term, much more limited, and are designed around an organizational sponsor's interests. There's always been a certain amount of this kind of thing happening, and I think we do tend to over-idealize grassroots participation as something that's completely outside the system. But I think that this changes the way a lot of people encounter politics, and I do think that change is meaningful.
Hired guns with very big guns.
Might say that.
It's where we are.
In getting to this question,
Yeah.
I think it highlights one of the big sort of actors you've left out here, which is the role of the press. And I mean, you've said it several times that we seem to have this overly idealistic account of grassroots organizations, but work like Sarah Soberaj, right? She points out the way that journalists see these organizations completely in the opposite way. They have all this skepticism about grassroots is authentic, authentic actors, and so maybe you could talk a bit about that, right?
Right. So since this book came out, I've been talking to journalists a lot because the call that I often get is, I see this organization and I don't really know who's behind it. It seems like this industry is behind it, but can you tell me? And sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. But I think it's a question that journalists are often asking, right? They're trying to figure this out, and journalists do have a standards repertoire that they use for trying to ferret out what's going on here. What they often do is take a look at the organizations who are listed as partners, and then they'll call up those organizations, and a surprising amount of the time, those organizations don't remember ever signing on to it, or maybe they never did. So now the industry's actually had to respond to those journalistic practices, where now there was an interesting Nightline report that I consulted on about the soda tax battle in the Bay Area in the fall, and what they had done is exactly that. They went and called all the organizations, and they went actually directly to the shops to talk to the owners to see, did you actually sign on to this campaign? And a lot of them said no, but then the industry, it turns out, had actually taken records where they had signed letters saying I support this. So a lot of those groups actually did sign on, but maybe they didn't remember it. So the industry's actually had to respond to this journalistic practice, and that to me I think is interesting in thinking about how journalists are playing an important role in this. A lot of times what they also do is they look out for who's hiring people to come out to demonstrations on Craigslist. They also did that in the Nightline report. There was a major battle a few years ago about a major cable network taking this Ovation network off of its channel listings. And so you see this citizens organization sprout up called Citizens for Access to the Arts that was concerned about one and only one thing, and it was the Ovation network being taken off the air. And sure enough, a journalist was able to actually sort of infiltrated the campaign, if that's the right word, joined the campaign for pay, and came out to their protest event against the cable company. And so I think journalists are a really important mechanism for the public to know about this. And I think there's a really important lesson in there about the important role of journalism in society and helping us to understand who's behind advocacy campaigns, where is this coming from, and whose interests are being served. There's other actors that I think are important too, including government regulators and people who are concerned about disclosure. And some of the states do have grassroots lobbying disclosure requirements, which some people have been opposed to. There was a really interesting report by Institute of Justice, this libertarian think tank, called Mowing Down the Grassroots, that was all about how the state-level grassroots lobbying requirements have become increasingly onerous. So that's another way to look at it. Go ahead. You've been waiting.
I actually had a question. So you have the grassroots that is being done by corporations, and then you have the actual grassroots, the way that we, I guess, traditionally think about it. But I was wondering about your thoughts about something like the Sierra Club, for instance. And I'm just going to use that as an example. But these really large national environmental volunteer organizations, but that then they have these sort of larger. For for example, I've been doing some work with them and the Clean Power Plan that just came out from the Obama administration. But the National Sierra Club gave these talking points down to the state level, which gave these talking points down to their
Right.
local group levels, which I guess is grassroots, but it's almost got this sort of corporate feel to it in the way
Right.
that they're interacting
Well,
and enacting these campaigns.
And this is an idea that actually goes back to my former advisor John McCarthy's ideas about social movements. I mean, I think we need to think about advocacy organizations as facing certain kinds of similar problems to other kinds of organizations. They need to develop resources. They need to find a way to get people interested in their cause. They need a way to incentivize participation and get over free rider problems and collective action dilemmas. I think those are things that all kinds of different organizations face. And a lot of national advocacy organizations, they do have this kind of problem. I mean, Robert Michel's talked about this, 100 years ago, talking about the problem of the iron law of oligarchy, right? And even the radical organizations sort of become conservative over time. And yesterday's revolutionaries are tomorrow's politicians. I mean, these are things that we know a lot about. And we can think about this in terms of institutionalization. Some political scientists call it the protest business. I mean, these are really common phenomena. And I think it gets into a much more normative and ideological territory rather than analytic territory, and thinking about what's like fully, truly grassroots, where it's all the letters are written on grandma's stationery, and and there's no financial support at all, except for bake sales and things like this. Every organization, if they want to stick around for some time, is going to need to find some way to develop office structures and fund themselves and keep themselves staffed. And I think that's a reality that's worth acknowledging.
Is this, in your opinion, an American solely phenomenon,
No.
or do you see that in other countries?
It's a great question. So I have a paper looking at this that I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested, looking at this cross-nationally. So I did a comparison of how this takes place in the US, France, Norway, and Germany. You see a huge amount of this in the US, just about none in France. It's only when the French are involved at EU level that they seem to be involved in this. And even there, they're much less involved than a lot of the other EU member countries. The Germans do seem to do this a lot, but the Germans are a heavily corporatist system. And so a lot of what you see in terms of German grassroots lobbying is run through the manufacturers associations, essentially what followed from the guilds of generations ago. In Norway, you see a surprising amount of this, I would say, where when nuclear plants are trying to locate in a new facility in a new area, they often will do this kind of work, in not only consulting with local communities, but reaching out and trying to mobilize local communities in favor of their engagement. But the most of this that takes place. It's in the big liberal market economies, the Anglo countries for the most part. So a ton of this in the US, a lot in the UK, Canada. Australia's had major battles over this, especially around environmental issues. There was a huge campaign, it was called a Convoy of No Confidence, in which the trucking industry in Australia essentially took over the highways of large parts of Australia to sort of protest environmental regulations. And they had a very similar large-scale campaign against this initiative to do plain packaging for tobacco, such that no tobacco actual brand images show up on the cigarette boxes, and they show nothing but like diseased lungs and things to make people stop buying them. There was talk about doing this in the U.S., but it didn't really go very far. But the tobacco industry was heavily mobilized in Australia, using a lot of these consulting firms when they were really threatened by the plain packaging issue.
What would be your explanation as to the lack of this kind of campaign in France?
Well, I mean, Frank and I have talked about this before. It's a relatively small advocacy group sector in France. I mean, it's highly statist system, without a huge amount of independent civil society organizations. And so there are efforts by some of the manufacturers associations to do these kinds of things in France, but it's much more conventional lobbying with people who are connected to people in positions of political power. And in fact, with Frank's help, I reached out to a bunch of people at Sciences Po when I was writing this paper to see, among a number of these leading political scientists, if any of them could think of a single campaign like this in France in recent memory, and none of them could. And Frank, I don't know if you've ever encountered any of these in your experience in France, but.
Not from the big corporations. I mean, I think the thing that would be interesting is like the big supermarkets would like to open on Sundays, and then the small shopkeepers have always been a very powerful organization. And you see that in a lot of countries, but I don't know where it stands right now in France with that type of thing. But I think that is more what we think of as true grassroots. That is, shopkeepers really are organized.
Yeah.
And they really don't want to open on Sundays,
Right.
and they really do mobilize. But you don't see the corporate campaign to.
Right.
You used to see it from this one company, Leclerc, had a big public relations campaign.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Encourage